The 10th century, a span of 100 years so bleak, so chaotic, that later historians gave a name that chills even now, the Iron Century. Imagine a Europe where kings are murdered by their own kin, where churches are seized like fortresses, and where common people live as if the world itself is ending. By the year 900, the dream of Charlemagne's empire, once a beacon of order, had crumbled into fragments. His descendants tore it to pieces like wolves over a carcass. Viking raiders still carved blood into the coastlines. Magyar stormed in from the east, and Saracen pirates swept up from the Mediterranean. For peasants, for monks, for queens and nobles, the question was not how do we thrive, but simply how do we survive the night. This was not the Middle Ages of shining knights and soaring cathedrals. This was a century of darkness, where famine, fire, and fear walked hand in hand. In the 10th century, civilization itself seemed ready to collapse, and some believed God had abandoned them altogether. Power was supposed to rest in crowns, but in the 10th century, crowns meant nothing. Kings were poisoned, stabbed, betrayed in their sleep. The West Frankish kingdom, what we would one day call France, was a battlefield of cousins and dukes, each scheming to wear crowns so cheapened that no one obeyed it. In East Francia, the future Germany, royal authority fractured into a patchwork of warlords and bishops, each raising their own armies, each ruling like miniature kings. Italy fared even worse. There, the throne was passed like a cursed relic, bought with bribes, seized with swords, lost in ambushes. In a single lifetime, you might see a half-dozen kings claim the same crown, each promising peace, each delivering only more war. The people who tilled the fields, who prayed in the churches, who lived in fragile wooden towns. They had no protector. Instead, they saw rulers treating kingdoms like gambling chips, while the real world burned around them. This was the political landscape of the 10th century, chaos masquerading as monarchy. As kings faltered, invaders pressed harder. Vikings, no longer content with plunder, carved permanent settlements in Ireland, England, and Normandy. Their ships were dragons of oak and iron, striking terror wherever rivers ran deep. From the east came the Magyars, swift horsemen whose arrows darkened the skies. They descended on German villages and Italian plains, vanishing before armies could respond, leaving only ashes behind. And from the Mediterranean, Saracen pirates stormed up from North Africa, seizing ports, burning monasteries, enslaving coastal communities. No frontier was safe. For the common farmer, the night was alive with rumors, sails on the horizon, hooves thundering across the steppe, torches on the mountain paths. And so Europe lived in a state of siege, not for a year, not for a decade, but for generations. Children were born into war and grew up never knowing peace. It was a century where the enemy was always at the gate, and the gate was always breaking. Even the church, once thought unshakable, descended into scandal. The papacy itself, the very throne of St. Peter, was consumed by corruption. By the mid-900s, the papal palace in Rome had become little more than the plaything of feuding Roman families. The powerful Theophylactic clan installed their favorites as popes, sometimes boys barely out of childhood, sometimes men bribed into the role. And when their usefulness ended, they were deposed, imprisoned, or murdered. This was the so-called Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, when the successors of Peter were pawns of warlords and mistresses. Imagine the despair of the faithful. If even Rome, the holy city itself, was drowning in sin and blood, what hope was there for the rest of Christendom? Priests sold sacraments like merchants at market stalls. Bishops fought wars like dukes. And monasteries, once sanctuaries of learning, were looted, abandoned, or left in ruins. The church, which should have been the light in the darkness, flickered low. If war and corruption were not enough, nature itself seemed to conspire against the people of the 10th century. Crops failed with terrifying regularity. Harsh winters and summer droughts brought famine across Europe. When granaries emptied, people ate bark, grass, even the flesh of the dead. In some chronicles, There are whispers of villages turning to cannibalism to survive. Towns were little more than clusters of timber, vulnerable to fire. A single spark could consume entire neighborhoods, leaving survivors with nothing but ashes. Life expectancy was brutally short. Disease swept through weakened populations. Women died in childbirth. Children before their first winters. To live past 40 was almost a miracle. And everywhere, the shadow of hunger lingered. For the vast majority of people, life was not about thriving but enduring. Each day wrestled from the jaws of despair. As the century dragged on, a new fear spread like wildfire. The fear that the end of days was near. Christian Europe read the chaos, the wars, the plagues, the corruption of the church, as signs of the apocalypse. The approach of the year 1000 loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Many believed the world would simply end, that Christ would return in judgment. And when every village lived under constant threat, whether Vikings, Magyars, famine, or fire, who could blame them? It truly felt as though history itself was collapsing. Monks recorded visions of comets and eclipses as divine warnings. Peasants clutched relics and prayed for salvation. And the powerful, who lived by murder and betrayal, also whispered in fear. For even they suspected that the clock of the world was running out. The 10th century was not only an age of violence, it was an age of dread. And yet, even in this iron century, life did not vanish. The Vikings who once terrorized Europe slowly became settlers and kings. The Magyars, after decades of raiding, embraced Christianity and began to build Hungary. In Germany, the Etonian dynasty rose, trying to patch the shattered order left by Charlemagne. And in monasteries, some monks still copied books by candlelight, preserving scraps of knowledge that would one day fuel a rebirth. The 10th century was a crucible, one of the darkest ages in European memory. But it did not destroy civilization. It tested it, bent it, nearly broke it, and out of that trial, the seeds of the later Middle Ages were planted. Historians sometimes call the 10th century a forgotten age, hidden between the grandeur of Charlemagne and the rise of high medieval kingdoms. But forgetfulness is a luxury. For those who lived it, this was the age of survival. Kings proved treacherous, the church corrupt, the skies filled with enemies, the fields with hunger. It was, in every sense, the hardest century of the Middle Ages. And perhaps that is why it deserves to be remembered. The 10th century shows us that history is not always progress, not always the march toward glory. Sometimes it is a story of collapse, of fear, of people clinging to life in a world that seemed to be ending. It was the worst of times, but it is also proof that even in the darkest century, humanity endures.